Welcome back to another episode of Catholic Single and Flourishing. I'm your host, Chad Etzel, helping Catholic singles live their God inspired purpose today and pave a path for their vocation in the future. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Chad underscore Etzel and also on LinkedIn at Chad Etzel. Well, in one of the previous episodes, we talked about the 7 highly effective habits for Catholic singles. And what I started with was a book review, and I started with the 7 habits of highly effective people. I only covered a couple of them. I really dove into especially the first habit, which is be proactive. And I find that so important. A number of my episodes have really had content from that particular book. And I'm going to continue with my book reviews with one of the habits actually of 7 habits of highly effective people, which is begin with the end in mind. I addressed that a little bit in that episode, but I'm going to be continuing to do that because a lot of us Catholic singles need to figure out what is that vision God wants for me. Where is God leading me? And that's what's going to help us direct our lives and build the decisions that we make on a day in and day out basis. Now, in particular, within this episode, because many of us Catholic singles ultimately want to be married in the future, I want to talk about a book that has been completely transformative for me, and I think is one of my favorite books of all time: Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love, written by Dr. Edward Sri. Now, this book was actually written based on John Paul II's Love and Responsibility, very popular work in Catholic Christian circles. And I highly recommend reading Love and Responsibility. But I know a lot of my friends have shared, and I experience this as well, where maybe I don't read very well, and and especially things from John Paul II. It's hard for me to comprehend things from John Paul II. So Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love helps to break that down, helps to understand what is he really trying to get after here. So I highly recommend starting with Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love if you're going to read something like Love and Responsibility by John Paul II. Also, just a note that I want to say, Dr. Sri did join me on the podcast. It was episode 26, so please check that out. It was The Art of Living and the Catholic Single Life. We had a discussion on another one of his books when it comes to the Catholic single life. So I urge you after this episode to please check that out if you like this content here. So when it comes to the Catholic single life, I think it's very important that we identify what is that vision of marriage. What is something that I can work to? Because then I have a direction that I can build my life around and work towards. It's really difficult, I think, a lot of times because we have different visions, competing visions of what authentic love actually looks like in our world today. I think about some of the cultural visions of love. A lot of it comes from stories, the movies that are out there, the songs that are out there. There's a lot of romantic comedies with this whole idea that happily ever after is fulfillment. That is the goal that I have for my life. And I even think about when I was a kid, Aladdin. It was a Disney movie that I basically knew all the words to. I watched over and over and over as a kid. And it ends with the scene of Jasmine and Aladdin riding off on the magic carpet, saying, "A whole new world, a whole new life." They're singing this, and that is the vision of happily ever after. And how much of that really gets into our psyches, especially from a young age, is just actually incredible if we sit down and think about it. And if I'm striving after that personal fulfillment, that feelings based sort of vision of what love is and what fulfillment is, then it's understandable that I might build my life to supporting me and my comforts and my own happiness, which is not necessarily bad. It's an understandable position because it's coming from this place of, well, if I get what I want when I want it, then I'm going to be happy. That's a fairly understandable position to be coming from. But ultimately, it is incomplete. It falls short of what we are made for as human beings. And the Christian version of love is the image of Christ. It is not feelings focused, like the cultural vision of love, but it's person focused. This is a love that is all about self gift and sacrifice. It's objective when it comes down to it, as simply just subjective, which is the cultural view. There's a pursuit of a common good. There's virtue. There's friendship that we're striving together to develop. There's something greater than just myself. And we see that most fully with Jesus Christ dying on the cross for the church. Christ laying his life down for his bride, the church, which we see in Revelation. Ultimately, it culminates in the book of Revelation, in the marriage between the Lamb and his bride, the church. There's a lot of wisdom in this. And I think as we hold it up to the cultural view of love, which is very self focused, it is self fulfillment driven, we see that there are some differences here. The Christian view of love, as I mentioned, the cultural view of love, there's some good about it, but it's incomplete. But the Christian view of love is the thing that is the most fulfilling. Why is this the case? Well, the Christian church has been able to reflect on this in her wisdom over the years. Fulfillment is not about what I get whenever I want it, but it's through sacrifice, through self-gift. John Paul II oftentimes quotes this, and Dr. Edward Sri in Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love points to him saying this, that oftentimes one of the most quoted lines by John Paul II is that man cannot find himself except through a sincere gift of self. Essentially, what that means is that man is ultimately truly fulfilled, not by getting whatever he wants, but by giving of himself to others. It is a radical paradigm shift, and I think this is very important for our world to understand. Love is not ultimately about me and my feelings, but it's a pursuit of something that is outside of myself, something that is greater than myself. That's ultimately what love is about. But what is love? And I want to take some time to just define what love is, because it's very easy to get sucked into just in a sort of assumption of what love actually is. I know defining love may not be the most, I don't know, sexy thing in the world, but I think a lot of people think of love as, well, I know it and when I feel it. But I think that's really where some of the challenge is. That actually may be where the problem is. We don't know what love is. We don't have that vision of love. So we don't really know what to strive for, because we just kind of assume that it's there. It's this feeling that I get. But classically, Christianity has understood love isn't simply a feeling, that is an aspect of it, but it is ultimately to will the good of another. And I think more so than just wanting the good of another, but to actually pursue the good for somebody else. So if I love somebody, I want what's best for him, or I want what's best for her. These the feelings of attraction, I do want to say, as I mentioned on the cultural view of love, it's very feeling based. These feelings aren't necessarily bad. They're not inherently bad. They are good in a certain sense, but they're incomplete. What we have to remember is we can't mistake these feelings that we have, these attractions, for love itself. Our feelings merely point us to something else, something bigger, something greater than ourselves. And as Dr. Street puts it in Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love, he says, John Paul II says that the sexual urge can provide the raw material from which acts of love may arise, if it is guided by a sense of responsibility for the other person. Okay, breaking that down, sexual urge, that sexual desire that we have, it can provide for the raw material which acts of love may arise. So, in a sense, that the attractions are raw material for love. They are the motive for being able to love. That me as a man, if I'm attracted to a woman and she's single and she's appropriate to pursue, then I am motivated by my attraction to her to ask her out. But I'm not going to be stuck just within those feelings. Eventually, I want to build a life with her. I want to get married. I want to have kids. I want to raise kids. And that's where love flourishes, is this gift of self, of myself to her and to our kids. Going back to this idea, I think we often make the mistake of thinking that my attraction is love itself. And that's ultimately what fulfills me. But what I really want to highlight and really want to drill in here is that this attraction is a call to love. It isn't simply love itself. It is an aspect of love, but it is something that calls me out of myself to honor and serve this woman that I love. I really want to use this, and I think Dr. Sri does really well in the book, highlighting a couple of stories here where culturally we have this vision of love and how it's incomplete versus the Christian vision of love and self sacrifice. And he uses two stories which are very similar. One is a story of a couple which he calls Phil and Lorraine, changes the names, of course, just to protect identities. But what happened with this married couple? They had this family, but Lorraine came down with cancer and she ended up in a wheelchair. Her health declined quite a bit, and this was not what Phil had imagined marriage to be. Faced with this pressure of taking care of his wife, he just decided to abandon his wife and abandon his kids. And this is really where a possibility of where the cultural love can lead us towards. If I'm just in the relationship because what I get out of it, then my love is incomplete. I'm not making a gift of myself. And it's understandable why somebody in this situation like Phil might leave, because this is not what I was expecting to achieve in the movies. And it's understandable then that I make decisions about my relationship based on my own self interest. So it's a very sad situation, very sad story. But what's fascinating is in this book, Dr. Sri uses this other example of a couple that he knew, Doug and Michelle. Similar thing, Michelle, instead of getting cancer, she ended up getting multiple sclerosis. Her nervous system started breaking down. She ended up in a wheelchair. And what Doug did, he didn't leave her, but he retired from a job that he loved 7 years early in order to take care of her full time. Then, as Michelle's health declined, she started losing her ability to talk and move. He had to do everything for her. He had to bathe her, he had to feed her, he had to take her out for walks, and he was doing absolutely everything for her. They couldn't even have a conversation, all while doing this. But Doug in this case was there for her. This is the vision that we're called into in terms of love, and we're called into marriage. That this is the love of Christ laying his life down for the church. This is not about self-interest. It's not about what do I get out of it, but out of self-gift, very much of what Doug is called to, and very much so of what vows married couples make on the altar of, I give myself to you and only you for the rest of my life, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. That's the ultimate calling, and ultimately what is fulfilling. This is a maturing in love, and I think that a distinction that Dr. Sri makes is kind of this cultural vision of love, which is incomplete and immature, to maturing in love, which that second story with Doug and Michelle was very fleshed out. I heard this analogy, and I think Dr. Sri has used this a number of times, where we have freedom, we have free will, we can choose to do things. But when it comes to the piano, I don't know how to play the piano, but I'm free. I have the free will to bang on keys, but I don't have real freedom for excellence when it comes to playing Mozart's symphonies and just really great, beautiful music. I don't have that freedom. That is something that I could practice and work up to, but I don't have that freedom. When it comes to the world, when it comes to the culture, I think we just kind of assume that, okay, we know how to love. But love is something that actually needs to be practiced and built up to. It is something that we can grow in. And this is an opportunity as single people that we can grow in, and we can choose to grow in today. There's some practicals that are covered in this particular book. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here, just kind of outside of the book. We as single people have the opportunity to cultivate this growth in this gift of self. We can serve others. We can cultivate this mindset of service towards others. The single life is an opportunity for us to grow in a sense that we can't flip a switch when we get married. But this is the time where we can grow as people, as individuals, in our virtue and our personal growth. I think one example of that, most people hire me as a coach to help them with their personal finances. Personal finances, if we remember, it's not about me, but ultimately it's about what God is calling me to. It's about my vocation. There's a certain point where I realize that it's not about just me being self-sustainable, but how do I build a foundation, a financial foundation for the future in my future family? Another part within that personal finance sphere is giving 10% of our salary, tithing. Tithe means 1/10, giving one tenth of what we earn to other great causes, charities, missions, the church, and so on. Now, even if you're not doing anything right now, I think it's really helpful to just get on a plan. And even if you were to start at 1 or 2 or 3% this year, and then build 1% next year, 1% the year after, building up to that point where you're at 10%. I think 10% is a good rule of thumb. It's the traditional amount. It's something where it allows you to remember that this is not about me. It's about the finances, the resources that God has given me, is about supporting his world, his kingdom. And then in addition to that, what I would add is that you're supporting that, but you're also learning how to live simply and live like Christ. Another thing is tithing our time, something an area that I could grow in a little bit more, is giving of myself to other great causes and serving others in a self-sacrificial way in volunteer service. When in Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love, they talk about three types of friendships. This is something that I just want to highlight as we wrap up our conversation here in this episode. There's three types of friendship that Dr. Edward Sri talks about, that John Paul II talks about, that Aristotle ultimately talked about. Two are incomplete. They're good, but they're incomplete. And then the third is what we want to strive after. The first two are pleasure-based friendships and utility-based friendships. Pleasure-based friendships, it's kind of like, hey, I hang out with my friends and we watch football. Nothing wrong with that, but it is short of where we're ultimately called to go in terms of making a gift of ourselves. Then the second level, or the second type of friendship, is a utility based friendship. I invite somebody over to paint my house and I make friends with this person and I give him money, he paints the house, which would be kind of odd because I live in an HOA that has vinyl siding, but whatever. Those are necessary types of relationships, and it's okay to have those types of relationships, but ultimately they are not as fulfilling as virtue based friendships. And virtue based friendships are that third type. Virtue based friendships essentially are those friendships. Dr. Sri says this: the two friends are united not in self interest, it's not what I get out of it, but in the pursuit of a common goal, the good life, the moral life that is found in virtue. Virtue becomes the center of what they're both striving for. To give you an example of something from my own life, there was a situation that came up in my homeowners association. There was a big meeting, and it was a very quick letter that we got. And I had a feeling that not a lot of people knew about this, and I wanted to make sure that people knew about this. Well, I asked a friend who I thought, hey, could you actually help me pass out some flyers just to make sure people know about this? He personally had no stake in this. There was nothing that he was getting out of it. But the reason that he did it was because he knew that it would be good for him to do it. He didn't want to do it necessarily, but he knew it would be good for him and he knew it would help me out. That's a virtue based friendship. It's the pursuit of a common goal. He knew that it was good for him to grow in virtue. He knew it was good for me to grow in virtue, and ultimately together our friendship in pursuing this common good for a community of 88 households, for the good of them as well. That's really what virtue based friendship is about, is giving that gift of self for the sake of something greater. Dr. Sri says in Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love, specifically when it comes to marriage, in Christian marriage, that common aim involves the union of the spouses serving each other and helping each other grow in holiness, and the procreation and education of offspring. So that virtue, that common good that unites the spouses in marriage, ultimately is about the two coming together, their growth in holiness, and the procreation and education of children. It's not about adults and their feelings. That's what marriage is not about. It's not about adults and their self-fulfillment, but it's about pursuing something greater than themselves, in this case family life. He continues on: our own individual preferences and agendas should be subordinated to these higher goods. So I may want to go, if I were married, hypothetically, I may want to go climb Mount Kilimanjaro or something like that. But my family's got to come first because I have made that choice. I have made that commitment before God, before my spouse, before everybody else witnessing to the marriage. Well, what does this mean for us as singles? So here we have this vision that I think Dr. Edward Sri does very well to create this vision along with John Paul II. And we as single people have an opportunity to move towards that. We can do that through certain things like building intentional communal relationships and friendships with people on a regular basis. And I think it's important that we do things on a regular basis. One which could be regular Bible studies or regular discussion groups, men's and women's groups, prayer groups, where we're doing something intentionally to grow together in faith and in knowledge and friendship with one another. So those are ways that you can participate and grow in as a single person, because this is how we practice. Similar to that example I talked about the piano earlier, we can practice to be able to grow in love during our time as single peoples, and that's one of the reasons Catholic Single and Flourishing exists as a podcast, is to help you wherever you're coming from. Going back, I do want to say too, pleasure and utility friendships are not necessarily bad. they are often necessary, but these types of friendships ultimately fall short of what is most fulfilling, and that is making a true gift of ourselves. And ultimately, as single people, we live a purposeful life when we make our lives about others and it's not simply about ourselves. So, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Catholic Single and Flourishing. I urge you to pick up a copy of Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love and ultimately get Love and Responsibility as well. I think both of those are very good resources, especially getting a vision for love and a vision for marriage, especially as a single person. You can also check out an ebook that I wrote myself. It's on overcoming the cycle of pressure and inaction. So if you're feeling some sort of tension or anxiety as it relates to your single life, I definitely want to recommend you check that out. That'll be linked in the show notes. And you can check out all my coaching offerings at CSF, Catholic Single and Flourishing, csfcoaching.com. Thank you so much for listening today. Live inspired, live God inspired.